Greetings, comrades, and welcome back to another episode of the Comrade Cast, coming in way later than I would like. It has been extremely busy in my life, but we are here now to talk about the tail end of the Canadian election. Obviously, the election is in a couple days, so we're going to be spending the majority, if not the entire episode, talking about what things look like, what we can expect, and in addition to that, I am happy to announce we are doing another live stream. We are going to be covering the results as they come in. So I'm extremely excited about this. I love to do election live streams. They're always a ton of fun. It's great to collectively watch the results come in, and we can all have a good time and enjoy sitting back, talking, analyzing, and just having a grand time. So look forward to that. That'll be April 28th. My intention is to start it at 5 o'clock Pacific time, and that would be 8 o'clock Eastern time. That's 6 o'clock my time, but that should give us a little bit of time to sit and discuss before the results start coming in. One thing, let's start this off by giving you guys something that we can look at coming at election day that will give us a very quick window into what to expect for the night. So here we have, this is a really great interactive map of all of the federal ridings in Canada. Of course, ridings are the equivalent of districts in the United States. And as the election happens, it's really like 343 individual elections happening at one time. And whoever ends up getting the most amount of seats, whose party that is, will end up becoming prime minister. It's different than, say, the American system where you vote on your congressperson, you vote on your senator, and you vote on the president all differently, right? You can mix and match your choices. Here in the parliamentary system that has been gifted to us by Great Britain, you have one vote and that's it. And one thing that it does make is pretty quick results on the election night. So why we're looking at here, these are the Atlantic provinces. This is Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and of course, Prince Edward Island. And these provinces collectively end up reporting their results about, I believe it's either an hour or 2 hours ahead of the rest of the country. And they used to have a system where votes would just come in based upon time zone, right? So you would know what was happening in the east of the country, and effectively you would know who would win before the polls would close in the west of the country. And they changed that back in, I believe it was 2015 or 2011. I can't remember the exact election that they changed that system. But they changed it outside of the Atlantic provinces. All of the provinces are going to report their results at the same time. And the reason why this was such an issue is if you were in British Columbia, you would know who won potentially before you actually went out and voted. And obviously that would be a pretty discouraging thing. Even if, who you wanted to win won, you probably wouldn't go out and vote because you're like, what's the point? And vice versa. If whoever you wanted to win lost, what's the point? There's no point in going out and voting when the results are already decided. We're going to get into a little bit of the math here and why the eastern provinces are going to be so decisive in this election. We'll also talk a little bit about how this imbalance fuels Western alienation and angers a lot of people out in the Western provinces like myself. So we'll delve into that a little bit. But I want to focus again on these Atlantic provinces because they're going to report their results sooner than the rest of the country. And this will give us a little bit of a canary in the coal mine, if you will, as to how the rest of the election will pan out. I remember in 2015, that was Justin Trudeau's big majority. He swept all of these Atlantic provinces, and you could tell that the Liberals are going to have a good night because these provinces showed massive returns for the Liberal Party, and that held consistently throughout the rest of the country. And then in 2019 and in 2021, you saw that Liberal dominance erode a little bit. They were still the predominant party in those Atlantic provinces, but they lost more and more seats with every election. And that was an indicator that they would still probably do well, but now instead of having a majority, they're going to have a minority. So come election night during the live stream, these provinces will either have completely reported or will just start reporting depending on when the live stream starts. And if we see the Conservatives doing well in these provinces, it's going to be an indicator that they are going to be doing well across the country, and vice versa. If we see continued Liberal dominance in Atlantic Canada, then it's going to be a pretty big indication that they're going to have a strong night as well. So now let us catch you guys up a little bit in terms of what has happened in this campaign. We had the one and only English debate, which really sucks. I hate that there's not more debates. There should be more debates. There was, of course, a French debate. And to be honest, I usually skip the French debate because A, I don't speak French, and B, I hate listening to the after translations. Like everybody's debating and talking in French, and then they'll have for English speakers, you can tune into the debate, and then they'll have a translator trying to translate what they're trying to say as it goes on. And I just hate that. That just sucks. And realistically, only one province really cares about the French debate, being the only French-speaking province of Quebec. The only thing I was really curious about from this debate was how good was Mark Carney's French going to be, being the only leader on the stage who has not debated in French. In fact, he's not debated at all, but much less in a second language. That is going to be key to see how his chances are in Quebec, because if he has shitty French, Quebecers are going to turn their back on him. They don't want to elect a prime minister that they feel can't speak their language effectively. And from talking to the French Canadians who watched the debate, they tell me that his French was pretty good. He was clear and articulate. The only thing is that he spoke really slowly, apparently. Obviously, I can't judge, not speaking the language myself, but that's what I have heard about the French debate. Although overall, outside that, I've heard mixed opinions in terms of who won the French debate. I've heard some people say that Pierre Poilievre had a strong night, as well as Yves-François Blanchet. He's the guy right here. Let me just circle him for you. He's this guy right here. He's the leader of the Bloc Québécois. They are a federal party, but they only run candidates in Quebec. And effectively, their position is that they're going to go to the House of Commons and just argue for Quebec's interests all of the time. So I heard that both these two guys had a pretty good night in terms of the French debate. But when it came to the English debate, I think that Yves-François Blanchet did an incredible job. He was just hysterical. He was there just trolling everybody. And his answer to everything was always, Quebec! And then he had what might be my favorite debate moment of all time, when the moderator, who by the way was Steve Aiken, who did an incredible job, Canadian treasure, that guy, also apparently never ages because he's been moderating debates since before I was a teenager, effectively. Anyway, he did a great job, but he basically asked every candidate like a follow-up question depending on the topic that they were talking about. And I don't know if exactly he just didn't bother or skipped over Blanchet. And then Blanchet basically says, and here comes my terrible French accent, since I was not asked the question, I'm going to ask a question to myself. It's just like, what a Chad moment. Just standing up there and being like, you know what? Fuck you guys. I'm going to ask myself my own questions. So I think he did very well in terms of shoring up his support in Quebec. And that's actually bad news for the Liberals, because they could go into a potential situation where they need to form a coalition with the Bloc to get over that majority threshold. And that's something that a lot of Canadians don't like outside of Quebec. So there could be a potential there where if the Bloc does well, then you have a Liberal Bloc coalition, and a lot of people outside of Quebec aren't exactly enthused about that prospect. And then also, as much as you guys obviously know that I'm not a supporter of Pierre, I think he had a good debate night, to be quite honest, in the English debate. He came out and did what he needed to do. He wasn't going to convince the people who aren't going to vote for him, like me. Well, I've already voted. And if you have followed this channel, you'll know that I am NDP supporter. So I voted NDP in advance voting. I always vote in advance. And I have never once in my life voted for either the Liberal or Conservative Party, and I sure ain't changing that now. Regardless, though, I think Pierre did what he needed to do, which was look polished, look professional, but also avoid a lot of the rhetoric which he has been using, which kind of turns people off. And in addition to that, he needed to kind of shore up this latent fear that a lot of people have that he is going to be very close to Trump and veer our country off in that direction. And many Canadians are not enthused about that prospect either. But he came out and he did what he needed to do. And I think that has buoyed his chances. We're going to look at the polls here a little bit because they've been narrowing going into the final stretch of the election. Pierre managed to avoid popping off, yapping about a woman's biological clock and stuff like that. And I know that kind of rhetoric really fires up his base, but it turns a lot of Canadians off. And if you guys have been following politics for any amount of time, you'll know that, and this is actually something I think that right-wing people are generally better at than left-wing people, which is how you say something matters more than what you say or the factuality of what you say. So, for example, the point that Pierre was trying to make is that you want to buy a house while you're still young and, you still have time to enjoy having a family. You don't want to wait until you're 40, 50 years old before you own your first house. But the way he frames that message by saying that women should be able to buy a house before their biological clock ticks out is a very off-putting way to deliver a message which should resonate with everybody. But instead, you deliver it in a divisive way which turns people off and makes people second guess you. Regardless, though, my point is that he managed to avoid any mistakes like that. When it comes to Mark Carney, you guys know Mark Carney's not my guy. I haven't voted for him. As I said, I've not voted for the Liberal Party ever in my entire life, and Mark Carney was not going to change that for me. And I personally think he came off okay. It was pretty clear that this was the first time he has done a debate in his life. He is not used to this kind of thing. And when he was getting dogpiled on by all of the leaders, right, because there are points when all of the other parties are taking pot shots at him, you could tell that he was visibly flustered and struggling to keep up. But overall, for someone's first debate, it was an okay performance. And I don't think it really ended up changing people's minds a whole lot. I do think that there are some people maybe on the soft fringes that were convinced to vote conservative after this debate. But I don't think that was enough to change the fact that Mark Carney is still the front runner in this race and looks poised to end up winning it. And on to Jagmeet. I know a lot of people had a lot of issues with his interruptions. The thing is, the guy's fighting for his political life right now. This is probably the last time that he can really make his case. And you can't just sit there and wait for people to give you your opportunity. You have to seize it where you can. The only thing is that he had some points where he did some very excellent interruptions and managed to stagger both Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre visibly and make it so he threw them off their game. The issue is that he kept interrupting too much. And it almost came off like a Trump style of debate performance where that's how Trump debates, is that he very frequently interrupts his opponents, tries to throw them off, that kind of stuff. And overall, I think that Jagmeet really needed to be more strategic with his interruptions, because I do think that he ended up turning a lot of people off, even though I understand what he's trying to do. I just think he missed the mark. And I think that if the way things look, how they're going to look on election night, Jagmeet will probably step down as NDP leader. And his biggest problem as a leader is that he thought that he was bigger than the party itself. Like, I got some of the election material for the NDP, and you can see that Jagmeet's name is in huge letters, and then little tiny NDP. So he basically thinks that he owns the party, that he's bigger than the party, and especially from a left-wing perspective, that almost never works. So that was the debate. Real quick rundown. Overall, I would say that it will lean some voters in the conservative camp, but not enough to make the difference. Now, let's go to the polls as we head into the final stretch. This is our aggregate of polls, and we can see that the Conservatives have gained a slight bit of steam. They're now at 11% to win the most amount of seats, and we can also see the polls narrowing. So let's just quickly look at some of the final polls going into this election, we can see that the Liberals have maintained a narrowing, but still enough of a lead to put them over the top. We can see that we have a Liberal lead between +2 and +5, and you can even see sometimes it's just +1. Back a couple days ago, you did see some Conservative ties, and even here, Main Street has, this is now a couple days old, this is almost a week old, they had the Conservatives leading by 4 points. Unfortunately for them, the way that our electoral system works is going to make it very difficult for the Conservatives to win, A, the most amount of seats, and B, an outright majority. One of the differences here between how our elections shake out and how elections shake out in the United States is that in our federal system, cities have much more electoral power than rural areas, whereas in the United States, rural areas tend to have outsized political influence for their population. And that's because a huge amount of seats are not just concentrated in the most populous provinces, which are Ontario and Quebec, and a huge amount of seats are concentrated in the 2 largest cities in both those provinces. So if we go back to our electoral map here, you can see that the cities have been taken out of the picture. They've been zoomed in because there's a lot of ridings obviously concentrated there. And I did some math here that depending on how you calculate the Greater Toronto Area and the Montreal metro area, these 2 cities alone, just these 2 cities, represent 25% of the total seats in the House of Commons. And back when Justin Trudeau was still running, the last holdout for him, the last Liberal stronghold, was Montreal. They tend to be a very strong Liberal area, not just for the federal party, but even for the Quebec Liberals. That tends to be their base because that is where the largest amount of English-speaking Quebecers live, is in Montreal. So Montreal is almost certainly going to stay as a Liberal stronghold. And then moving to Toronto, when Trudeau was still in power, it looked like the Conservatives were set to make major gains in Toronto. Now, that has flipped, and I think that Toronto is going to be a pretty safe Liberal area. And because these 2 major cities, making up about 25% of the entire seat count, are most certainly going to be Liberal areas, that makes it very difficult for the Conservatives to overcome that. They need to make substantial headway in cities if they are going to form government, and especially if they're going to form a majority government. And coming to Western alienation a little bit here, that Quebec and Ontario make up between them 58% of the entire seats in the country, meaning that if the Liberals win these 2 provinces alone, which it looks like they're set to do, plus other provinces, it's game over effectively. The Conservatives can win every other seat in the entire country, which equates to 129 seats with the new 343 map. So they can win every other seat from every other province, including the Atlantic provinces, the territories, the Western provinces, and that's not even close to a majority. So the whole election right now is going to come down to one province, and only one province, and that is the province of Ontario. Because Ontario has so many seats, because it's so populous, the Conservatives really need to win here if they're going to form government, and right now it doesn't look the best for them. I think that even the most dyed-in-the-wool Conservative supporter can admit that they are not going to win in Quebec. Let's just check out the Quebec polls here real quick. And so in the Quebec polls, we see that the Liberals still have a strong lead, and the Bloc and the Conservatives are jockeying for second place. And this actually does work in the Liberals' favor because of our first-past-the-post system. If Bloc and Conservative supporters end up splitting the vote in a lot of ridings, that means that the Liberals can ride up and take the province easily. So I think even the most, again, dyed-in-the-wool Conservative supporter will admit that Quebec isn't in the cards for them in this election. It all comes down to Ontario. And right now, the regional outlook looks like the Liberals are leading comfortably in the province. So this is the major hurdle for the Conservatives. If we go back to our map here, we can see that the Liberals are comfortably leading in those two provinces. The Conservatives are only leading in Alberta and Saskatchewan. But even if they were actually leading in BC last time I checked. That was interesting that the debate itself seemed to have the largest amount of impact in BC, where it flipped from liberal leaning to conservative leaning, although it looks like it's gone back now. A lot of people also think that BC is like a very left-leaning province. That's not 100% accurate. The island, the coast, they're all very left-leaning, but as soon as you get to the interior, it's very conservative. So it's actually a lot more split than people think. But that being said, even if the Conservatives were able to pick up all of the seats in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, they wouldn't come anywhere close to forming government unless they did well in Ontario. And that's really, I think, going to be the entire story of the election, is who wins that one province is going to win the entire election. And this is a very common story throughout Canadian politics. It's very rare for a politician to get a majority government and not win both these provinces. It's happened a couple times where a prime minister will only win one of Quebec or Ontario and form a majority, but it's pretty uncommon in Canadian history. And in order for the Conservatives to win, they're going to have to win in Ontario. They're going to have to do very well there. And it doesn't seem like they are going to be able to. And one of the big issues for the Conservatives in this country is that they are effectively two parties forced together. There's two different strains of conservatism in this country: the Eastern conservatism and the Western conservatism. And the Eastern conservatism in places like the Atlantic provinces in Ontario is rooted in what the old Progressive Conservative Party used to be. And they are a brand of conservatives that is very focused in on fiscal issues. They're very fiscally focused and motivated, but when it comes to more social issues, they tend to be a little bit more to the left. Things like gay marriage, abortion, that kind of stuff. Whereas in the West, over here, that brand of conservatism tends to be a lot more reflective of what you would see in the Republican Party in the United States. And you can see for the governments which have formed in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, they tend to mirror a lot of the same talking points that you would find from Republican candidates in the United States. So they tend to be much more conservative on social issues. But when it comes to fiscal spending, they're a little bit looser. It's not something that they're really focused in on. It's something that they'll occasionally touch on, but it's really those kind of social issues, those culture war issues that drive a lot of the conservative thought in Western Canada. And for a long time, these two conservative strands used to be two different parties. You had the Reform in the West that later became the Canadian Alliance. Then you had the Progressive Conservatives in the East. And Stephen Harper, one of his political achievements was merging those two wings together into the Canadian Conservative Party. And since then, they've been together. But since Stephen Harper, one leader from one strain of the conservative thought rises to the top. The previous leader, Aaron O'Toole, was a more Eastern conservative, whereas Pierre is definitely a Western-leaning conservative. And the unfortunate part for Pierre is that this Western conservative thinking does not play very well in the most populous provinces in this country. And then on top of that, there is one more curse that the Conservatives need to overcome to win this election. And that is they need to overcome the Ontario reverse curse, where provincially Ontario always votes the opposite of what their provincial party is. So Doug Ford is currently the Premier of Ontario. He has won 3 consecutive Conservative majorities. Obviously a guy who knows how to win elections, even though I might not be in his camp. I can respect what he's been able to do in that province in terms of being able to solidify political power for conservatives. But you'll have noticed every time that Doug Ford has won, the Liberals end up winning federally in Ontario. And back in the times when Stephen Harper used to be the Prime Minister, the Liberals would win in Ontario provincially, but federally the Conservatives would end up winning. So there's this weird phenomena, and you can keep going back and back, and throughout Canadian history, you'll find that this weird phenomena is replicated over and over again. And it's crazy because Doug Ford has basically offered no help to the federal Conservative Party. He isn't letting his MLAs really campaign for them. He's not campaigning on behalf of Pierre. He is just letting them do their own thing. And I think that is because he understands politically that the type of conservatism that Pierre represents is not that popular in his own province. So we are going to have to see if Pierre can break that curse. And the thing is, because of the way seats are distributed in this country, even if the Conservatives win the popular vote, which they have in the last two elections, because they will win the seats out here in Alberta and Saskatchewan and the interior of BC very comfortably by huge margins. They'll run up those seats by 70, 80%. And then the Liberals will squeak by with like 40% victories in a lot of other ridings in the province. So effectively, like I said, it's reversed from what happens in the United States, where the Republicans have a more efficient vote, or here the Liberals have a more efficient vote. And this comes back to what I said at the start of the show, which is that this imbalance of power between the provinces fuels Western alienation. And I get it. Having lived in Western Canada my entire life, it is frustrating to have a government that we didn't choose, or in a lot of times didn't even come close to choosing, dictate what is happening in these provinces. And it can be very disheartening for a lot of people to see that their values probably won't ever be represented in the federal government. And that obviously leads to the next course of action in their mind, which is that in order for my values to be seen and to be fulfilled at a federal level, we have to split off and become our own country, or in some cases, they might even talk about joining the United States. It would be like if in the United States that it didn't really matter how the rest of the states voted because of the large cities and large population in places like California and New York and Illinois. These larger states end up being the ones who dictate how the entire country goes every single time without any kind of recourse. And that's the one thing that the United States, because there's so many different states, and right, the population is much more diffused from north to south, east to west. This basically means that a lot of the time it's a lot harder for single alienation type of scenarios to arise. You might see alienation in large areas, like you'll see like Southern alienation. They feel like their values may not be represented in the federal government, but that's a coalition of states. It's not like there's one state or two states that really drive what happens. And I do think it's a pretty serious issue, but I don't know how to really resolve it unless we move past the post, where we have an actual representative system of democracy, where your vote, no matter which part of the country you are, can actually have an impact on the rest of it. And without a fairer voting system, I think Western alienation is going to continue to foment. And who knows if Danielle Smith is going to do something drastic if the Liberals win another term. She's been hinting that maybe she'll do something crazy. She'll have a referendum in Alberta to potentially leave the country. Who knows if stuff like that is going to happen. But there is a serious possibility that if Liberals win another majority government and the Conservatives do very well out west, that can increase that sense of Western alienation and then increase the sentiment of Western separation. So that's pretty much all I've got to say with this election heading into its final days. So we're going to wrap it up here. I hope you guys will come and join us for the live stream as we watch the results come in real time. It's going to be a great show. Got lots of surprises, lots of fun things planned for you guys. And obviously, I think that we're going to see another liberal, either majority or minority. I'm not sure which one yet. And the only way that changes is if we see a vast upset in the province of Ontario. If it looks like the Ontarians are going to be voting for the Conservatives, then they'll be able to cruise to at least a minority government. Probably not a majority. I think the majority government might be outside the bounds of what the Conservatives are able to pull off for this election, but they certainly have a minority in the cards, particularly if Ontario doesn't vote the way that the polls seem to indicate that it will. So with that, this has been the Comrade signing off for now. Until next time, you guys take care.